Good morning. Happy Easter. I'm so thankful that you chose to join us here today at the Greenbrier Church Online as we wrap up our series on resurrection stories. During the recent epidemic, Trista and I subscribed to a couple of streaming services. The thought was that since the movie theaters were closed, we would just watch the movies at the house. Plus, it's a whole lot more comfortable to fall asleep on the couch than in a movie theater. We looked at our options and we subscribed to Disney Plus because they carry all the Marvel movies. And we subscribed to HBO Max because they carry all the DC movies. And before you ask, yes, we picked our subscription services based solely on the fact that they carried TV shows and movies based on comic books. I've always been interested in superheroes, and there were times in my life that I daydreamed about being a superhero. It's actually a pretty common daydream. I remember when I was little and the bell would ring for us to go out to recess, we would all run out to this big oak tree that served as our Hall of Justice, where Superman and Wonder Woman and Batman and the Flash and Aquaman and even the Wonder Twins at times would go out and save the world. When you were little, you might not have daydreamed about being Superman or Wonder Woman, but you might have pretended to be the Lone Ranger or G.I. Joe or any other number of heroes that we were able to see in movies and on television. Every child spends time daydreaming because it's the only way that they can make things right. You see, when you're smaller and you're younger than everyone else, you never get the chance to be in charge. You don't get to make the rules or do what you want to do. You have to go to bed when you're told to go to bed. You have to take a bath when someone decides it's time for you to take a bath. They force you to go to school. There's always somebody who is older or bigger or meaner that gets to make the decisions about your life and what you're going to do. So we all find a natural outlet. We daydream. And in our daydreams, we're no longer helpless. We're heroes. We punish the wrong. We reward the good. We make our own decisions. We pursued what we thought was right, and we got to choose what we wanted to do. In our daydreams, good always wins. Evil is always vanquished, and it always makes sense. But as we get older, we tend to daydream a little less. We lose our hope that a superhero is going to show up in just the nick of time and make everything all right. Unfortunately, many of us have become overwhelmed and a little helpless and hopeless. We live our lives just like the two travelers walking home after Jesus was crucified. This morning, as we conclude this series, I want to spend some time in the 24th chapter of Luke. Luke is a masterful storyteller, and his retelling of the events that take place on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus is one of the greatest stories in the entire Bible. In the story, we discover two travelers who have gotten to the point that they no longer dream of being a superhero. As a matter of fact, they believe that their superhero was defeated, and now the only thing they can do is give up and go home. I would love for you to read along with me, starting in verse 13. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened, and as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. We don't know much about these two travelers. As a matter of fact, all we do know is that they lived 7 miles from Jerusalem, and one of them had the name Cleophas. Whoever they are, they're completely disheartened. We assume that they had spent the last week in Jerusalem where they were able to see Jesus and to hear him teach. It was a glorious week up until the time that Jesus was betrayed and arrested and then crucified. Now all of their hopes and their dreams are shattered and they're gone. It's all over, and they're painfully and slowly making their way home. It seems that they had stayed in Jerusalem just long enough to hear some rumors about an empty tomb. Some women were telling that Jesus had appeared to them. Some of the apostles, Peter and John, had gone to the tomb. They confirmed that it was empty, but how or when? Well, nobody really seemed to know for sure. Nobody knew what to believe or who to believe. It was all so much, and they needed to do something, but when your leader dies, you have very limited options. So when they're lost, they just decided to go home. And as they were walking along, they run into this stranger. This brief encounter on the road to Emmaus is one of the most vivid resurrection appearances stories that we have. Luke thought it was important enough to include it as a part of the story that he's writing to Theophilus. And I'm eternally grateful because it has so much to teach us about discouragement and frustration. I want you to notice first and foremost that this scene, well, it plays out on a road. It's not an upper room or a garden or a mountaintop or any of the other places where we would expect revelation to take place. It's just on a road. And I also want you to notice that when Jesus shows up, there's no pronouncement of his resurrection. There are no angels, no trumpets, no lengthy discourse about faith and sin. Instead, Jesus does something that's completely off script, or at least what we would consider to be off script. Jesus invites these travelers to join him in a simple conversation. On this Easter morning, I think it's extremely important. You see, sometimes it's enough to just see Jesus or to hear of his resurrection or to be promised of his presence, and sometimes we need more. Sometimes it takes longer than the words of someone who says they saw an empty tomb. Sometimes the move from doubt and fear, from grief to hope, takes as long as a walk from one town to another. And it takes us having the opportunity to have an open and honest conversation. It's my prayer that we would dedicate ourselves to follow the example of what's happening on this road. We need to be people where others have the time to think through what they've read and to hear and to experience. We need to give people the space to talk about life, not in some religious, grandiose way filled with right-sounding church phrases and sound bits. We need a place for people to be truthful about life and how it hurts to be here separated from God in this broken place. The family of God needs to make sure that we have the emotional bandwidth to be honest about our disappointments as we try to share enough grace and mercy to explore each other's questions and doubts. I believe that the three most important words in this entire text for us this morning are found in verse 21, where we read, "We had hoped." Luke says these two travelers had hoped Jesus was the one that was going to redeem Israel. But right now, seeing what they could see, understanding what they could understand, all of their hope was gone. In their pain and own personal darkness, they couldn't see Jesus or what Jesus had accomplished because it doesn't line up with what they were hoping for. It's a struggle that each one of us are far too acquainted with. We have the same struggle and we've said the same words, but our words have less to do with the redemption of Jerusalem and a whole lot more to do with getting things right in our own personal kingdoms. We also say we had hoped. We had hoped our child would recover. We had hoped this job would last. We had hoped for a better relationship. We had hoped that cancer would go into remission. We had hoped that our church would grow. Few things are more painful than dashed hopes. I believe that it's powerful that Jesus is going to take some time to talk with these two disciples and explain the scriptures to them. I believe that we need to take some time today to talk about the fact that Jesus reveals himself through the breaking of the bread. But first, before we do all of that, we need to notice that Jesus does something extremely important. The first thing that Jesus does when he arrives on the scene is to ask these heartbroken disciples to name their loss. That's such a powerful illustration and example for women and men and church families that want to be faithful to God. You see, I'm afraid we've gotten it backwards. I think that we believe the first thing that we have to do is to explain or to describe. Yet the first thing Jesus does in a text is listen. Jesus invites them to talk about and to share their pain. Every one of us carry our own pain and loss. We never talk about it because we're ashamed of it. We're embarrassed. We struggle with what we did or what was done to us. And we believe that the best thing that we can do is bury that shame down deep into places that we never explore, that we never travel. But as we see in our text, naming our pain is important if we want to find healing. When we name our pain, our grief, our loss, they lose the power to enslave us in shame. And while forgiveness and peace does not mean that we'll never be able to truly leave that pain and the scars behind, it gives us the room to once again be surprised by God's love. These two disciples are disappointed based on their own misunderstanding of what God's accomplishing in the world. They were trying to make sense of what God's doing from their 6-foot perspective, and they never stopped to realize that God's working everything out from his 6,000-foot perspective. They wanted God to save the world through power and might, and God came into the world to save us through vulnerability and peace. They had this misunderstanding where they expected a conquering hero, but Jesus shows up as a suffering servant. And while it might be tempting to chastise them for their lack of understanding, we have to understand that everything that they experienced or everything they had been taught pointed to the fact that Jesus was going to be a warrior king, set up an earthly kingdom. It was impossible for them to imagine what God had in store through the life and work of Jesus because they're just looking through this 6-foot view. But here's the thing for us this morning. The disciples drowning in their disappointment and sorrow because they misunderstood God's work, and yet their pain and their grief was real. It was immense. So in his compassion, the first thing Jesus does is invites them to talk about their pain so that he can find the room to surprise them by God's love. This morning, as we stand outside an empty tomb 2,000 years later, God is still pouring out his love and compassion to those that have been hurt by their own misunderstanding of what God is accomplishing in our communities. When we take the time to talk about our grief, our disappointment, our fear, in the safety of this community of family and faith, we find the room to be surprised by God's presence and love in our own lives as well. As their journey draws to an end, these two travelers move from dashed hopes to burning hearts. Let's go back to the text and pick up the story in verse 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. N.T. Wright makes an interesting observation about our text this morning. The very first time we see people eating in the Bible happens in Genesis chapter 3. Adam and Eve eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it was during that first recorded meal that mankind ushered in this separation between God and his creation. Fast forward to a little house in Emmaus, and we get a chance to see another meal. But I want you to notice that this meal closes that separation between the Creator and the creation. That's the beauty of communion. It serves to remind us of what God has done to close the gap that we created. We're all traveling on that road to Emmaus this morning, and sometimes our dreams are shattered. Sometimes all we can do is cry. Sometimes we just want to hide in our shame. Jesus never promises to take the road away. Rather, Jesus promises to come and to walk the road with us, and not just for part of the journey. He says that he'll walk with us all the way home. He gives us the time to talk about our pain and disappointment, our shame and our doubt. Jesus listens to our hearts and provides us the space to be surprised by his love. Unfortunately, it's so easy for us to slip into neutral spirituality and just allow things to come and go. We go to church because it's Sunday morning, but we never experience the stirring of God's Spirit in our lives. We take other people's words, we accept their doctrine, and we never strive to find the warmth of God's love in our own lives. We look but never see. We listen but never hear. This morning, as we make our way to the tables, we need to understand that we're gathering on holy ground. I love the fact that every time we gather at the tables, we experience the truth of the cross and the resurrection. But today it seems even more so. On that beautiful Sunday morning, Christ rose from the dead and he brought life out of the grave. On that first Easter Sunday, Jesus met with the disciples and formed a faithful community out of a fragmented group. And this morning, as we share this time of communion, God does it all over again. God builds community out of fragmented followers. He once again shows us what grace and mercy look like so that we will find the room to be amazed by his love. So as we make our way to the tables this morning, I want us to take a cue from our Lord. This morning, as we look into the bread, as we look into the cup, I want us to take some time to name what things we're grieving or fearing or suffering. But let me interject here that we're not talking about confession. I believe confession is important for our souls. We need a time to confess the sinful and selfish things that we've done. But today I want us to have the space to confess all of the difficult areas of our lives. Maybe we can take the time to confess that things haven't turned out the way that we hoped. Maybe we can confess how we feel our own hopelessness, and we can take time to confess the things that we worry will never be normal again. And it's in that confession that we can not only experience God's promise of grace and forgiveness and acceptance, but more importantly, we can begin to move from dashed hopes of the early part of the story to the burning hearts at the end. Dashed hopes to burning hearts, confession to the Lord's Supper, disappointment to joy. This is the heart of our Christian faith. And so this morning we're being called from a cross to an empty tomb, from death to life. The road's before us. Jesus has offered to walk with us, to listen, and to provide room for us to be surprised once again by God's incredible love. I hope that you have a blessed Easter. And as we make our way to the tables this morning, I hope that you find the space to be amazed by God's love in your life. I pray you have a great week. Go in peace, and I'll see you soon.